I'd now like to introduce Mitchell Davis. Mitchell Davis is the Chief Strategy Officer at the James Beard Foundation, and he's been there for 25 years, maybe more. And he really is instrumental, and this is a factual statement, it's not waxing poetic. He's instrumental in every strategic program that the foundation has come up with. He's a cookbook author, he's a food journalist, he's a scholar, and he's also a really, really good baker. There's nothing that I've ever had of his that I wouldn't say, my God, you should open a bakery or something. And more than anyone I know, Mitchell has the ability to connect people, ideas, and even conflicting views and kind of bring out the best in everyone and to draw parallels and similarities between people that no one else I know can do. His brain operates on a strategic level that I greatly, greatly admire. And even though he's a PhD in food studies at NYU, he actually has a PhD in sharing. So.
Thank you, Emily. I'm going to ask the panelists to come up and join me, if I may. Take your assigned roles. I have to say, this will get me in trouble. Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. But I love the theme of this conference because when people ask me if sometimes I'm asked, I should say, if I'm a wine person or a food person. And I always say I'm a food person, and that's partly because I'm a food person, but it's also because food people, in my mind, are all about sharing. Food people you can make another one in the kitchen. You can put something else in the oven. You can feed someone else. And I love wine, and I love wine people. But drinking the last bottle is a different experience. And pastry, as Emily said, is that place where sharing is what it's all about. You can't make one, or you would never make one of anything. You make a whole. You make multiples. You make them perfect. And today, we're going to take some of those themes that Emily said, and with my esteemed panelists, we're going to try to really operationalize them in the business of pastry, because the reality is that, yes, sharing is great, and social media has led to so many wonderful things, probably first and foremost the cronut, but beyond that,
thank you for this.
Beyond that, an incredible enthusiasm and appreciation for the work that you do. But there are some real practicalities to sharing everything you know in a world with so many people aspiring to be unique, to make careers and successful businesses out of the stuff that they know that is different from everyone else. So we've assembled a panel that I think ranges across a broad spectrum of the industry. And I'll introduce them very briefly because they may not need any introduction. Rose Levy-Birnbaum is the author of many wonderful books, but will only ever be known as the author of the Cake Bible, probably one of the best-selling cookbooks of all time. And interestingly, I think a book that shared in minute detail and with exact precision just about everything at that moment that Rose knew about baking, about those cakes. Ron Ben Israel, who has been sharing his passion for cakes and pastries from the first time he put a cake in the window that led to a career and right up to the Food Network shows and the amazing passion that he's managed to communicate with us to the world through TV. And Zoe Canaan, close. Zoe Canaan, who is the head baker at Simon and the Whale in the studio in the Freehand Hotel, where like many of you on a daily basis is sharing everything that she does and stands for. I'll put this up here because I don't want to bend down anymore. By serving hundreds of people a day, thousands a week at those popular restaurants. And I'm going to start, Rose, by asking you, since you became famous for sharing, so to speak, in slow media, in old-fashioned traditional media, the book form. How things have changed from your perspective in the presentation of the pastry chef or the baker and the role that sharing plays in sort of growing an identity and creating a career. I'm going to start with you. Tell me, give us some thoughts. You need a microphone. You pick up your microphone. Yeah.
It's not an ice cream cone.
It's been a long time because I watch you on social media, right? It's not an ice cream cone. And I know that you have a beautiful set of Royal Copenhagen china, that you take beautiful pictures of simple cakes. But tell me about the process of putting everything you know out there in the world in a book versus the way that the world works today.
Well, when I started, people were keeping secrets. In fact, I think I started writing magazine articles because that was my only way of possessing what I was teaching in class. And I think most cooking schools, they wouldn't give out recipes. You just have to write down all the things. You might get the ingredients. But my goal was to have it for myself all in one place when I did the book. And I had already started writing magazine articles, and it was very helpful because part of the reason I think the book sold so well right out of its launch pad was the fact that the press knew who I was, not readers. I mean, once a reader came in and said, I think it was Cook's Magazine, "Can you make this as a wedding cake?" And I said, "Yes, I made it for the magazine." And she said, "You did?" She didn't know it was my cake. So, but the press did.
Right.
So that when the Cake Bible came out, and they've been waiting a long time for it, because I had been waiting a long time for a contract, and I didn't have the idea that I should start working before I got the contract. That has changed. I now usually have the book written before even the editor knows what I'm writing. But it was very different of how many years ago, 32 years ago, that the Cake Bible came out. And now it's just a whole different publishing scene.
Thanks. Ron, you've shared, you do something very unique that has become a sort of passion, a sideline of so many people and inspired so many others. And I'd like you to also talk a little bit about what you've seen change in the advent of social media and the sort of globalization of the individual expression and proprietary creativity that people have. What have you seen?
Nothing has changed.
You're very high tech there, speaking to a spatula. That's nice.
Be jealous. This is not just any spatula. It's a reducing spatula by Rose, and these are the first prototypes, right?
No, this is the launching at the Housework show. So I showed you the prototype, but this just came, so I wanted you guys to have it.
The reducing spatula.
Anyway, really nothing has changed. By the way, I told them not to give me a microphone, and they insisted, so now it's not my fault if I don't stop talking. But nothing has changed because over 20 years ago, Rose and I sat together for coffee and cake, and we've been friends and for all this time, and I feel very well protected by her. Now there's many more books to have. I think what the difference is, it's the way we met. I wrote the publisher, and I expressed my gratitude for the Cake Bible, and then Rose called me, and we got together. And the difference is, just this morning I have 5 direct messages on Instagram. I want recipe. Sometimes they're in Russian, the messages. How did you do that? What are the measurements? And no decorum in approaching and asking anything. So that alarms me.
Right. But so that creates, in some ways, a community that did not exist before of pastry chefs, or that was harder, alone rolling out the dough, as Emily said, to just reach out to your phone and meet some of the most famous people in the business. No?
But is that a real community, clicking a button on Instagram and expecting immediate results? I think people don't buy books as they did.
Right.
My books, my favorite cooking books, are on my nightstand, and I study them and I immerse myself. So the expectation is to get printed recipes immediately from anywhere and download anything that supposedly will work. But many times it doesn't.
And if it doesn't, then you just call him or Instagram him.
Right.
Instagram him, what's wrong?
So I think everybody here is invested in the profession and
Right.
the community, and maybe we can bring back the idea that you have to invest in it by going to school, by purchasing a book, by going to a conference, and involving. We have to give something before we get back.
Right. Zoe, from your perspective, a different generation, an active working pastry chef who's come up post the stone tablets that some of us grew up with. What do you feel about the sharingness of information in the pastry community?
I mean, I think it's incredible that we now have the opportunity to interact with. Is this on?
Yeah.
to interact directly with people like Rose and Ron on Instagram, and when we're cooking through their books, if we're having an issue with something, we can reach out to them. But of course, you have to have respect for the work that they do, and I think reaching out and saying, what are the measurements for this is absolutely the wrong approach. And I think the decorum is really important in that exchange of information. So there's a right and wrong way to approach. And I think the expectation has to be there that perhaps they may not want to share, or they'll direct you, to another resource to gain that information.
Is there anything that any of you wouldn't tell someone? Is there something proprietary that you think should be kept secret?
My cholesterol count. My goal is to have people take from me, but I really like it when they give credit.
Yes.
Right.
Credit's so
Let's
important.
let's talk about that.
Acknowledgement.
Yeah. So why is that important?
I don't think anybody really owns a recipe or technique, but we sometimes think we do, and then somebody else at the same time has come up with a very similar thing, and we get annoyed because they haven't given us credit. But when something is really unique to a particular author, I think it's really important to show where things came from and to give a nod of thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And often, if I'm working on a new recipe and I'm researching and I'm reading a book, like Rose's Cake Bible, I'm feeling inspired by, the story and the emotion and all of that behind how the recipes come to be. And so I feel, compelled to credit her if I use a recipe that she makes, because that feels so important such an important piece of how I arrived at the recipe, that I've created from there.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I think it's important, and I think it relates to a shift in what baking and pastry is. And I'll say, when I go to Paris, on every corner of every street, there is a pastry shop that has a croissant and a baguette and a pain de mie, and no one claims those as their own right now. I mean, perhaps you've reinvented a way to laminate the dough. I don't know, but we're talking about something different a little bit, I think, because we're talking about invention and creativity. And I wonder if you could comment on the relationship between that traditional, I'm just a steward of these classic things, and the role that innovation and proprietary new ideas play.
I think a lot of what I learned comes from people like Rose. If you read the Cake Bible, there's so much mentioning of other people. And Nick Malgeri, I think, told you to use some cornstarch in pie dough, right?
You got
something?
the right idea.
And I think I read in Emily's in the Stars cookbook, pouring boiling water on the cocoa to extract, and I read it definitely in the Cake Bible. There's a lot of acknowledgement, especially when we lecture and talk to each other. Where did I get that? I always acknowledge Betty Van Nostrand, who taught me how to make sugar flour.
Right.
I think it gives respect to the profession.
Right.
And in fact, just about 2 weeks ago, I was really surprised when Bon Appetit, I saw this on social media, acknowledged my technique of mixing cakes. Now, I didn't invent that technique. I invented doing, if you were going to say invent, I was the first person to do it using butter when it was said that you could only do it with high ratio fat. But it was amazing that a magazine would give a nod on a video. And I won't mention any other names, but there are other magazines that lift my things that I think really were original.
Right.
And without even saying where it came from. It's as if everything was invented by them.
Well, and the notion of ownership is different in a social media world where you don't do it except to put it out there in some ways. The act of consumption has become taking the picture, not taking a fork to eat it. It's become this sort of the buffet, the pastry case of today, if you will, is Instagram, and we all follow Cédric Grolet's piping work as much as the next guy, envious of his fruits, so to speak.
Mitchell, at first, my publisher would go after every person who took my recipe, and I would as well. And now I just laugh because it's hopeless.
Oh, yes, of
In
course.
fact, somebody just asked me if I'd like to trademark my recipes as if one could. And I said, what's the point? I pay money for a trademark that nobody's going to pay any attention
Right.
to. Who has the money to follow up on those things? You can't sue everybody who takes a recipe. I remember when Barbara Trapp tried to do that with Martha Stewart, and it really, well, it
Yeah.
had some effect on our awareness of giving credit to other people. It was that strange flavored chicken. I mean, but Martha didn't know in the beginning that you're supposed to let people know if you lift a recipe. And maybe somebody in her team was the one responsible for it. But now people are aware. And I remember the point in time when we were told now that recipes could not be copyrighted. You could copyright the punctuation and the writing, but you can't copyright ingredients. And yet I had a company, it was Chicago Metallics, put my checkerboard cake on their box. Lock, stock, and punctuation mark is what I called it. And a friend of mine reproached them because she had a relationship with them, and it was kind of like, duh, we're not supposed to do that. If you can pass a law, people have to know the law is there.
Right.
Right.
I'm less concerned with recipes, more about the visual integrity.
Okay.
But when I think about my own history, I still use Elizabeth Faulkner's ideas that I saw in Citizen Kane, which was I went to visit her in San Francisco, and she had those destructured wedding cakes. Now I use them. It took me a while. They were so modernist and unusual.
She's here, and she's going to
So I'm giving
serve
you
you
credit
papers,
now.
right? Right after.
But visually, we all get influenced by different art periods, our own interpretation, paintings, fashion is a big influence. So you can't always pinpoint where inspiration came from, but I always try to acknowledge and not to copy exactly somebody. But we do own the copyright for our own photography. And when that's lifted, I try to approach the person who lifted. I sometimes say borrowed and try to convince them to take it down.
I also think about, what is it that makes people not want to give credit? And I imagine it's because they want to present that this is their own ingenuity. But actually, if a publication like Bon Appetit is crediting Rose with a specific method, it gives me more respect for that publication. It makes me feel like, they are knowledgeable about what they're doing. So I think, giving credit, whether it's, the way that Cedric Grolet is piping, or a method for mixing cakes, it actually communicates the integrity that you have in your craft.
And so credit in the media is one thing, on the menu perhaps something else. And I'm just wondering, when you go, Zoe, to put together a dessert list or a selection for pastry, what are you thinking about, or what are you thinking, what are you trying to accomplish with that, by putting that up there?
Ooh, a lot of different things. I think, right now, something that I have been hyper-focused on is incorporating high extraction flours into the work that I do, whole grains, and, broadening appreciation for those flavors. And I think often, for specific pastry techniques, those flours don't necessarily maneuver the way that we want them to, or the way that we expect them to. So I have been educating myself in how to use those flours and manipulate them to do what I want to do, and then help our diners have an appreciation for that by making puff pastry with whole grain flours and cakes and those kinds of things, because it's really important to me, and I really appreciate those flavors, and I think it's also, it's also more sustainable. So that is, sort of an educational piece of the menu. But then, of course, there's also, what do our diners want from the menu too? Is something that I always have to balance with that.
And do you find willingness to go to new places, or people just ask you why there isn't a chocolate chip cookie, or maybe there is a chocolate chip cookie on your menu?
There isn't a chocolate chip cookie right now. I do. I think it's a balance, and honestly, sometimes in New York, I think it depends on the day of the week, because on the weekends, maybe we have more out-of-towners that are, looking for a branded New York City night, and on a weekday, we might have Simon and the Whale is where we consider ourselves a neighborhood restaurant. So our intention is to serve people in our direct community, and I think those people are often more willing to push the bounds and look for something new that we've created because they trust us as the chefs and as the creators to feed them something delicious.
Ron, this notion of new intrigues me because you alluded to changing a visual style influenced by something you might have seen in the past, and yet you also are someone who's become known for a signature look or a certain thing that perhaps everybody wants the same XYZ. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit for the community about the difference between the signature and the new, if you will.
I was concentrating about Rose and Zoe's speeches, and I didn't really think in advance. I was just thinking, oh, so nice to sit between them and listen. But new is, I used to be the new kid, and now I'm more established. And we have in the middle, we have Charlotte, who's not new, Charlotte Newville, also a graduate of the FCI. But I don't know exactly who's new. Mm-hmm. I found from the beginning that it's very hard to introduce new ideas in wedding cakes, especially, and in celebrations, to clients that are so afraid about feeding 200-300 guests. So it took years before I convinced people to try passion fruit buttercream, because they were used only to lemon, and then to switch from raspberry to blackberry. And I found out that we have such a range of
It's radical, yeah.
And then passion fruit and caramel is like a. So it's very difficult in my arena to introduce new flavors and new ideas sometimes. It took years to get rid of the plastic columns. I refused to do, I learned it in Wilton class, in New York Cake, and I said, no, I'm not gonna do it anymore. And in 2 weeks, I'm doing a huge wedding cake for 600 people with columns. But we're making the columns out of pastillage. So it's very, I don't know, maybe Charlotte or other people can tell you what's the newest of the new.
Thank you, Charlotte. Maybe you'll be up here next year. It's not so much the new, it's how do you, in this crazy world where everyone's sharing everything and seeing everything, how do you assert a personality of your baking or something that you can claim as your own? And I wonder if, Rose, perhaps you might have some advice for folks starting out or in the midway in their career that we heard Jansen at the beginning talk about craft, and that's one thing because as we all know, no matter how precise a recipe you give anyone, everybody makes it differently. Sometimes you don't even recognize it when it's presented to you. But what would you say to folks trying to establish themselves and a point of view when it comes to baking?
I think it has to start with following someone whom you admire, and then you start getting ideas of your own. That's what happens to me, and now I get ideas even from my own things. In fact, just this week I was revisiting when I revised the Passion for Chocolate from France over 25 years ago, and I wanted to revisit some of those recipes, and I was amazed how after a quarter of a century how differently I see things. And I think that can happen from week to week. And it's not a question of thinking that it's your own because you've made somebody else's and now it's yours. It's that you inevitably start doing different things. Like with all the new technology, they didn't, Bernachon in Lyon did not have some of the things that we now have to work with. Nobody, for example, made ganache, and I didn't even know what it was, and a food processor. And the Bernachon said it can't be done, which is what they thought here too. And now that is the way to do it. So this is what makes you able to create new things, new ingredients, new technology, and getting together with Miro, for example, from Gramercy Tavern. We're always talking pastry and borrowing ideas, and it's just an evolution. Mm-hmm. So eventually things do become your own.
I should explain that we're sitting under a air conditioning vent, and that's why Rose put on her coat.
No, thank you. But I also have to say, maybe you all thought I was really nervous up here. But I was expecting hot kitchens, ovens, and it's 50 degrees out, and I brought my down jacket, but I thought maybe that was a bit of overkill. So thank you, Woody, for getting me your jacket.
Let's talk about taste for a second, which we sometimes forget, especially in this Instagram world where what something looks like is more important for many people, it seems, than what it actually tastes like. Because I also think pastry has been the one place where visual has always been as important, and I think the visual of the hot kitchen is perhaps, the prominence of visual in the hot kitchen is perhaps new for everybody, because it used to not matter that it was brown and braised and still was delicious, but now it matters. And I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on taste, whether traditional or innovative, or what, besides the innovation in what something looks like, we're looking towards, passion fruit or blackberry.
I would love to invent something that would be called scratchogram, so then we could transport, and the scent as well. What I do, part of my, I was formed stubborn, and I can't shake it off. But you need to be very stubborn as a pastry chef, a baker, a cake designer, because we have to stick to our ideals. We're very, I am very particular and very obsessive. And that translates. And the same thing with flavors. I insist that every celebrant comes and tastes our cakes before the order. I don't feel comfortable either sending out the samples because they're never presented at the same temperature or way. And I don't feel comfortable promising somebody a cake without them approving the flavors or adjusting them. So there's a direct relationship to that, which I hope will stay forever, that people come to a shop and taste.
It used to be that people weren't expecting a wedding cake to have any flavor at all. It was
Right.
all about showmanship.
Right.
And it reminds me of something that Emily just said before about pleasure and taste. I think people now are living by what will be the next wonderful taste. And I just have to share a kind of short, funny story of how years ago when I needed a new internist, and my husband, who was head of patient radiology, was very respected at NYU. This is relevant here because he sent me to one of his former interns, who is now one of the top physicians. And I guess he was expecting somebody very sedate and, well, not the way I turned out to be, because he was looking at my chart and he said, "What kind of business are you in?" And I knew that he was a wine lover because my husband thought maybe that was something I could connect to, as you were saying, that such an important word. And so what popped out of my mouth was, "I'm in the pleasure-giving business."
Requires a special set of tests.
How do you describe what you do? I mean, I was a writer, I designed equipment, I made wedding cakes, I love flavor. I thought, he'll be able to relate to that. He looked up from my chart in total astonishment. And then I
You need a
explained.
different set of tests for that.
But that is, when you think of Thailand, Thai food is so wonderful, but the Thai people, the first thought you give is of spirituality defines the country. And France, well, I don't know what the word is for it, je ne sais quoi. It's like they got it. In America, it's pleasure principle. We're all looking for pleasure. We all want to be pleased in many different ways. And I think food now has overtaken sex as the great interest of joy. And
But sometimes I
more
feel like
consistent. Maybe not for you, Ron.
but sometimes
I've said enough.
Well said.
Sometimes, don't you think that those pleasures are stuck in the 5th grade, the cupcake and the cookie? As opposed
No
to-
cupcake.
No.
There's a difference between pleasure and immediate gratification.
Right.
And I absolutely am against cupcakes, and I think they're over. To have just frosting smeared on a baked good and then in a paper cup, at least layer them.
I think on Instagram, it serves as a portfolio for us, and for some people, for professional Instagrammers, I think that the work that they're doing ends in many cases with that post. But for someone like us, it's meant to entice, when I post something, it's meant to entice people to come in, and buy it from our restaurant. So it's a little bit of a flex when you're posting, but it's also, you better be prepared to deliver, and it better look the way it does in the photo when people come in. And so when I'm posting something, I'm often posting, I like to do process shots, because I think it's, for me as a craftsperson, that's what helps me connect to what's being made, and I like to communicate that to others. But the final version is, come to the restaurant and see it for yourself there.
Right.
So.
The proof is in the pudding,
Exactly.
so to speak. Before we open it up to some questions from the audience, I'm curious. Excuse me. What would you tell people? How would you tell people to negotiate this world of open information for all, open source? What advice might you have to keep the focus on the right things, or what you believe those to be, whether it's the craft, the taste, the look, the community? And perhaps each of you could share a few words. Maybe we'll start with you, Zoe.
By the way, I'm Instagramming live because, and always tagging and crediting, because
Nice.
it grows like this.
Well, Ron is busy
Ron's
doing that, right?
Instagramming? I got distracted. Can you repeat that?
Well, some advice, right? To put out there how to negotiate the realities of having to make 200 whatevers every day, whatever, create a brand. Some advice for folks in this heavily shared community of baking.
Yeah, sure. When I came to culinary school here, I'm from Houston, Texas. I was obsessed with the idea of working at Milk Bar, which had newly opened, and I thought that what was happening there was really innovative. But I also kind of had this idea of myself doing, ultra fine dining, and I thought that was like the pinnacle of the industry. And while I was in school here, I was really aiming to reach that area of the industry, with all of the finery in the world. And I was able to get into the kitchen at Milk Bar by essentially harassing Christina at the bakery every day. At that point, I had a printed resume that I eventually caught her off guard and shoved in her hand. That had nothing on it, really. But through that experience, I think even though I had this connection that I felt to her that was kind of at odds with what I initially had envisioned for myself and my career. So I followed my instincts to work under her and try to understand what it is that drove all of the creativity and ingenuity that has come out of that bakery. And through that process, I learned that trusting those instincts to seek out people that I connected with was really the most important choice that I made along the way. And I had this kind of abstract thought of what I needed to do, but had this more grounded idea of what I should do. And that ultimately helped me come into my own as a chef.
So go with your gut.
Exactly.
Really, right. Ron, some advice?
Could you put your handle?
At Zoe Canan.
Zoe is absolutely right, and our late founder, Dorothy Kahn Hamilton, she got me to teach in the school, and I'm always grateful for that. And she said, you never know who you're going to meet in the corridors of the FCI that became ICC. And I would walk in and I would run into chefs, and everybody was available for the students. And that's an amazing thing. And also the emphasis, first working in the restaurant, and then internship. Everybody who works for us started as a student, became an intern, then if there's availability would work for us. I mean, Chef Kieran is here, who now teaches back in the school where she started. worked for us, worked all over the country. So that kind of old school is really, the old school is the new school.
Rose?
I think this will be a good time to mention something that I didn't want to leave out because it's related, and that's that I see creativity as being two types of things. One is innovation and the other is trendiness. And I think there's a real temptation to be noticed right away because of doing something outrageous that may fall on its face or may make you a star, but
Or
you'll
disappear,
disappear. Yes, it's very temporary. I mean, I personally always went for the classic, but it wasn't that I never could think of anything to improve on them. But I acknowledged the classics and this is one of the things I noticed when I took some classes at French culinary, when it was French culinary, is that you're taught the basics, and then you're not told that you're imprisoned. I hope you're not, and to stick with them. And once I was asked to speak to one of the classes, and I said, "Are you sure you want me to say what I have in mind?" But Chef Henri said, "Oh, bien sûr." So I said, before you're told what you're not allowed to do, do it. Try things on your own, because you're really surprised. I mean, like they told me in this country, as well as in France, as I mentioned, ganache could not be made in a food processor. But you want to know, this is why I wrote the Cake Bible the way I did. You want to know if you can't do something, why you can't do it, because it may change, ingredients may change, and it's no longer true. So, follow your own inner voice and first figure out before you get locked into something and decide if you want to be, and there's nothing wrong with being a trender. It's just you have to decide and be conscious of, is that what your goal is, or do you want to be known maybe for the next 40 years?
Right. All good advice. Well, a round of applause. Thank you for the panel. Don't go anywhere, because I don't think you always have an opportunity to ask questions of such an esteemed collection of folks from industry. So are there any questions on the topic of sharing and pastry in the age of social media, or on anything that you might want to throw at these folks in the corridors of ICC? Yes?
But how do you reconcile, particularly in a restaurant or a cake shop, your desire to push boundaries, to try new things, to innovate, to be creative in a new and different way, and what people want? Because I think, Zoe, you touched on it, the bridge and tunnel would look something a little different on the weekends, but you can't have two different menus. And, I definitely encounter that in restaurants as well. And how far to push it and how far is too far, and what's just going to be a success on Instagram but not actually sell.
I think that something that I've learned now that I've matured a little bit, hopefully, is to pick my battles. And sometimes I would do something that is more standardized because that's what the client is comfortable with. And then there's the special, everybody says two things. I'm very creative, I'm very visual, and I want something different. But
How about a pound cake?
once in a while somebody comes along and says, I envision, like in 2 weeks from now, a grand cake 5 feet tall with columns, and you can make them out of sugar and go. And then we figured out how to make it, and it's very exciting. But I don't insist. If somebody wants one of our classical designs, they're welcome to have it, as long as I don't have to use vegetable shortening and powdered sugar. And never this American, so-called American buttercream.
That's why you hate cupcakes, you cupcake hater. Other answers? It's a great question.
It is a great question, and I think I try to have some faith in our diners that they will read our menu and have a few items on my dessert menu that are crowd pleasers and that will satisfy someone who's really not necessarily looking for an exploratory journey of flavor in their meal, and then have something that's more self-serving for my desire to be creative and to innovate, and have the option available for others who are looking, to push the boundaries a little bit with what they're having for dinner or lunch or breakfast. So I think you have to balance it and have to acknowledge the fact that it's part of your professional responsibility to make something available to someone that's, you know, just all delicious in all the usual ways, and then have something else that pushes it a little bit more.
Rose?
I've noticed at some high-end restaurants that if a pastry chef wants to try something different that might not go over, that he educates the wait person, I forget what the politically correct term is, the person who's
Server.
I've been around too long, it
Server.
keeps changing, the server, the hostess, to be able to describe it in an enticing way, and maybe even to say, this is one of my favorites. I've fallen for that. And sometimes, more often than not, it was worth it. Sometimes I think, well, give me my money back on that one, but I took the risk and they took the risk. So I think that's a good way. And also, sometimes, I think Miro does this, where he sends out like a little sample of something.
I was going
to
to say,
test
send
the
it out,
waters.
yes, right.
And then people come back and they ask for it, and they're disappointed if they can't get it again. So, yeah, but that's a very nice way. They used to do that at Dean and Toluca. They would give little samples, and I think that's the best way to get people to try something new.
I think that's really important, and that kind of speaks to the hospitality element of what we do, and how, you know, just the conversation and connection that you have with the person serving you can really define and inform the way that you enjoy what you're eating.
As a diner, I also think it's important that it's delicious, not just interesting. That delicious. They're two different things, right?
Yes. Yes.
There's also we are in a different times, and I think they're good times. You know, there's so much more knowledge and appreciation and merchandising, but we all need it. We get paid so little compared to what we invest. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying there are better ways to make money than food. So,
But not as pleasurable.
exactly.
Where that's the thing.
So one thing I learned, you know, almost, you know, out there you have Rishi Tea, which is my favorite tea brand, and they very generous. So, you know, we make a tea with the Earl Grey. We make a cake with the Earl Grey tea, and we actually say Rishi Tea, and the brand of chocolate we work with, and sometimes the butter. So we acknowledge ingredients. I wish I had my own cow that I could say I chose the butter.
Like Thomas
We
Keller
don't go
and
that
his butter.
Yeah, but you can. We work in an environment that actually encourages acknowledgement and even sponsorship.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you, bro.
With all the social media, it can be very influential and very inspiring, but for both beginners and people well into their career, it can be very hard to not compare yourself on a success level to how far people have come. Do you have advice for people to not compare yourself so much, but just be satisfied with where you are?
Did everyone hear that question? How difficult it can be to compare yourself, even though you may be proud with what you're doing or your skill level or whatever, but you see 200,000 followers, or something becomes a meme on social media, and how do you deal with that, basically? What's the psychology of that?
I was about to grab my phone to see if I made it to the 10,000. I was 18 away.
I
All
did.
help me out. On Instagram. I mean, but on the other hand, I've seen other people, my colleagues who came out way after I did, who have thousands, you know, millions. And a couple of months ago, Jen.
10K.
I forgot other people can see, so you can't tell if you're looking for a sponsor. You can't tell them you've got 1 million people because they'll know. Anyway,
Right.
now I forgot what I was going to say.
But how
I'm
many
so
cake Bibles have sold?
I don't even know because changing publishers,
but over 1
HarperCollins
million.
bought Morrow. I'm sure it must be over 1 million by now.
Right.
But it's in the 55th printing. So the question is, did they do 10 in a printing or 50?
Doesn't matter. That's a big number.
No,
It doesn't
I'm
matter how
really
many
happy.
social media followers you have.
Anyway, my point is that those people who have been, who came out way after I did, maybe weren't even born when I was, have so many followers. And at first I thought, gee, people don't love me. But then I realized I'm very late to the table. I mean, it took my grandson to let me know I should be doing Instagram. And you know, it's a younger generation thing. And now nobody even hardly looks at the blog. But I was going to say something about somebody. Oh yes, the Jennifer Garner. I saw an Instagram video of her making a cake, and I was tagged, and I thought, well, it can't be the Jennifer Gardner because she's in a whole different world. But you know what? The celebrity Hollywood world is now in our world. I mean, maybe even too much, where they're making cookbooks and having somebody else do the recipes, and it's not about the recipes. It's like, I want to see a book by this
Right.
person. At
Yeah.
any rate, my social media went up triple within a couple of weeks, thanks to Jennifer Garner. She's become my new best friend. I mean, I'm sure she realized how generous she was and how she was helping me, but she's such a wonderful person. She was coming from the attitude that I helped her to be able to bake this chocolate bread from the Cake Bible. Actually, it's the Bread Bible, too.
Huh.
For her children. So it's a wonderful thing how our profession can cross boundaries and borders and connect us not just with other professions, but with the entire world. You know, that's what I love about social media. What I don't love is that it sucked me in, and I often waste a lot of time. Well, not waste, because you want to see what's out there. It's not like you want to compare yourself, but you want to know what's happening in the world, and often it's a very solitary thing, writing books. You don't, I mean, I look at the Times headlines, and that's about it. So I count on social media to know.
Have any of you seen something you've pursued on seen something on social media that you've pursued to figure out how or what or who it was?
All the time.
All the time,
You know,
yeah.
I
Yeah.
follow Charlotte and I follow here. I follow everybody probably in this room, and I look for visuals. I look for ideas. It keeps growing, and it's the most wonderful thing. It's like going to a museum every morning when I look
Right.
at Instagram. But I do have to say, I don't know about you, but I'm very human. I'm very susceptible to bouts of jealousy and self-doubt. I know I'm very unique like that. So I was very lucky from the beginning because I met Rose through writing to the publisher, and she was very kind to me. I think you paid for the coffee.
Wasn't it Maury Rubin City Bakery?
Maury Rubin City Bakery in the old place. But I take other people to coffee,
Right.
you know, if they're approached the right way. And I learned to have friends in the industry. So I would call Cynthia, I would call Cheryl Kleinman, who's not here. I call other people at 2 o'clock in the morning, like my friend Elisa Strauss from Confetti Cakes, to complain. So I have to deal, because we are susceptible to emotions. If I feel that something went wrong, or if I have a negative emotion, I learn to share it within a safe environment. Otherwise, by myself, I'm no good. You know, I'm listening to a crazy person.
Zoe?
Yeah, I absolutely am familiar with that feeling, and what I try to do if I am, you know, feel negative energy kind of balling up inside of me or envy while I'm on Instagram is I try to step back and just put it aside, and I'll pick up one of my cookbooks and dive into that, because you know that is really, for me, it serves as such a source of positivity, of inspiration, and I have so many that I have a lot, and some that I haven't picked up in years. So I'll try to just look at my collection with fresh eyes and pick up something and really do a deep dive there, and just kind of get inside this person's head. And get out of my own a little bit and kind of let the feeling pass.
Something that cookbook authors are always tempted to do is to see the reviews on Amazon. And that can give you a lot of humility, and I've learned the hard way never to give a negative response back. Well, not so much the hard way, but the one that's most memorable is when a woman said that she threw out my book, and her moniker was Horse Lady. And she said some really ugly things about my book, so my immediate response, because I always think humor is more important than keeping your image, is that if I were a horse, I sure wouldn't want you on my back. I was so proud
Things
of myself.
not to do in social media.
So I was so proud of myself that when I went into Houghton Mifflin, I told the marketing manager, who used to be the head of Amazon, by the way, and now is somewhere else, I said, "Oh, look what I said, wasn't that clever?" I mean, I didn't say that, but that was where I was coming from. And he said, "Get that right off and never write it negative." And the fact is that I've had a few negative letters before we had social media and the web. And my husband had advised me, and I think it's very good advice, that you can turn somebody who hates you into your biggest ally, because all they want is to be recognized. one person I didn't, that was before you gave me that advice, and I won't even talk about that, but because that's wasting your time. But I found that in every case that I did that, people would apologize and they would say, well, I didn't really mean that, or I'm your biggest fan in other ways, you know, so you always want to be positive, because really everybody wants to be loved. I mean, I'm really surprised. If you've seen Ron, I'm sure you all have seen him on television. I knew him before he became like the devil Ron. He was my angel Ron.
I'm back to
So
Angel
hear,
now.
So you have to hear him say that he wants to be loved. Who doesn't? You know, so I think people are, Woody's always telling me when somebody writes to me and I said, why are they even saying this? And he said, because they want to connect with you, they want a response. And sometimes people think they're more guaranteed of getting a good response if they say something, or any response if they are outrageous enough in their attack.
I want to ask each of you, I don't know why this question just came to me, but if you could direct message any pastry chef in history who before or after social media, who might you want to invite to share a piece of cake with?
Wow.
I'm trying to remember his name. It was Lenotre's relative, Karem. It was the one who was the architect.
Karem, yeah. Karem.
That just came to the top of my head,
Right.
like cream.
For me, it would be Julia Child, who I never met, with the
Yeah.
stories and the humanity and all kind of traits. But she would be the one I would be attracted to.
She is the person I would most like to have dinner with, period. I just was thinking it had to be a pastry chef. But when you look at Julia's recipe for croissant, you can consider her a pastry chef.
Right.
She was my inspiration.
Oh,
She
fantastic.
and Marie, who was the one for radiation, who discovered
Curie?
Marie Curie, because of her scientific approach. Oh, I'm so glad I thought of that, because that to me, I wanted to, this is the most important message, is the most exciting thing to happen these days, is like look what Nathan Myhrvold has done. And people's interest in science, their willingness to weigh. I mean, even in commercial bakeries, people, if they were weighing at all, were using grams, the metric system. That's what is changing our industries. Is more precision, the control freak by Breville. You know, people care about making things consistent and making things easy so that they can be excellent, not to dumb it down or use less quality, but rather to improve the quality in the best circumstances.
I think that's been holding back American home bakers so much, is the refusal to weigh ingredients.
Say more.
Oh, Zoe said the refusal of home bakers to weigh has hurt home bakers the most, and this has been my battle for over 20 years when I wrote the article for the LA Times Syndicate, Way to Bake, and all the reasons why it's easier and better. And I've been fighting even colleagues on it for years, and finally now I think 90% of baking books have weights and metric, all the better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I ever to write my recipe in a book, I'll title it "No More Stick of Butter." It's just something so unscientific.
But Ron, a stick is better than a cup. I mean, how, you know.
All right.
Right?
And on that note, I think.
What?
What?
Someone tell the New York Times that.
Someone
Okay,
tell
I've
us-
got an issue with kosher salt. I mean, it doesn't make you closer to God, especially not in baking. How the hell do you measure
Too
kosher
big.
salt? They're two different types to begin with.
Okay, on that note, let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
Amazing.